Our speaker today is Allison Dunatchik. Allison is a dual PhD candidate in sociology and demography at the University of Pennsylvania. She holds a Master's of Public Administration in Social Policy from the London School of Economics and a BA in Political Science from American University. Before embarking on her doctoral studies, she was a policy evaluation analyst at the National Centre for Social Research in London. Allison's research interests center on gender, work, and family, with a particular focus on how social policies affect gender inequalities inside and outside the household. And her research has been published in journals such as Gender and Society, Journal of European Social Policy, and Sociological Science. Thank you very much, Allison. Over to you. The mic is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Jenny. And thank you everybody for being here. I'm a big fan of the FemQuant network and the seminar series, so it's really exciting for me to be able to share some of my own work today. Today I'll be presenting some work from a paper titled Women's Superiority and Relationship Dissolution, a 29-country study. And this is some work in collaboration with Pilar Gonalons-Pons, who's also from the University of Pennsylvania. And in this paper, we're interested in we examine the association between women's economic power within different sex couples and the risk of separation. And specifically, we're really interested in trying to understand the mechanisms that might explain the positive association between women's greater economic status and the risk of union dissolution that's been identified in previous research. And I should mention that this is very much still a work in progress. So I'm excited to be here to sort of share what we've done so far, the results that we're seeing, and how we're sort of thinking through them. But equally, we'd be very appreciative for any thoughts, questions, ideas that you all have as well. And this paper is really motivated by recent discussions and recent research on the so-called end of hypergamy in different sex couples. Previous research across a wide variety of country contexts has shown that the reversal of the gender gap in educational attainment has led to an increase in hypogamous relationships where the woman is more highly educated than the man is. And at the same time, we've seen a decline in more sort of gender traditional hypergamous couples where the man is more highly educated than the woman is. And as women's relative education has increased within different sex partnerships, so has women's economic power within those partnerships as well. So this figure comes from a paper that was published in Population and Development Review by Esteve and colleagues, all on the end of hypergamy around the world. And they show in this figure how closely linked women's relative education is within different sex married couples, in this case, to relative earnings within couples. So we can see across a wide variety of European countries, in couples where the wife is more highly educated than the husband is, women have a much higher probability of being the primary breadwinner in the family as well. You might notice looking at the sort of range of the y-axis that even among couples where the wife is more highly educated than the husband is, the overall proportion of couples where the wife also earns more than the husband does is perhaps lower than you might expect. But still, we do see this positive association between women's relative education and the relative earnings within married couples. And more broadly, as women's education and labor force participation has increased over time, female breadwinnership has become increasingly common within wealthy countries as well. So for example, in my home country of the US, women out-earned their husbands in nearly a third of different sex marriages in 2021, which doubles the rate of female breadwinnership from about 40 years ago in 1981. And so this constitutes some pretty significant changes in the economic arrangements of different sex couples. And we've seen similar patterns of increasing rates of female breadwinnership in many European countries as well. And as women's relative education and their relative earnings has increased within different sex couples, a large body of scholarship has identified a positive association between women's greater educational or economic status within couples and the risk of union dissolution. And there are a variety of theoretical perspectives on why we might see this kind of positive association for different sex couples. For theorists like Becker and Parsons, women's superiority or superior status within couples puts a couple at greater risk of separating because these couples no longer conform to the kind of gender specialization and economic dependence that these theorists argue stabilize long-term relationships. From a more feminist or gender perspective, women's economic superiority within couples may increase the risk of separation because patriarchal gender norms really systematically discourage and stigmatize this type of economic arrangement within couples. And so following a gender non-normative economic arrangement may introduce a kind of gender stress or strain or gender stigma to the relationship that can undermine relationship satisfaction and lead to a greater risk of separating. And finally, an alternative explanation or theory is that women's greater socioeconomic status within couples may be associated with a greater risk of separating because this greater socioeconomic status enables women to leave unhappy relationships. So women with greater levels of education and higher levels of earnings are better able to support independent households. And so when conflict arises within couples where the women are more economically independent may be more likely to separate than couples where women are more economically dependent on their male partners. Several recent studies have found that the association between women's superiority and union dissolution is weakening over time, and that this association is fairly context dependent. So for example, some research by Christine Schwartz and colleagues has found that, especially in the US, the association between women's greater educational and economic status and the risk of divorce is declining in recent decades, so much so that this association is actually no longer statistically significant for more recent marriage cohorts. At the same time, some work by Kaplan and Steyer and Lynn Prince Cook has shown that the strength of the association between women's relative earnings and the risk of divorce varies substantially across country contexts. And these authors argue that this association varies systematically across welfare state regimes in particular. And so these more recent findings raise some questions about, what are the mechanisms driving this association between women's superior economic status and the risk of separation, and what factors might explain this type of variation across place and time. But much of the recent research on this topic has really focused predominantly on describing the association between women's economic superiority and the risk of separation, rather than trying to test specific mechanisms that might drive this relationship. And so this is precisely what we aim to do in our study. We leverage cross-national panel data to analyze the mechanisms that drive or explain the association between women's greater economic status and the risk of separation. And we focus on both context-level mechanisms and more micro-level individual or couple-level mechanisms. The first mechanism that we test is a gender culture mechanism. So reflecting feminist perspectives, it's possible that the association between women's relative earnings and separation may be a byproduct of patriarchal gender cultures. So because traditional gender ideologies really valorize a male breadwinner, female caregiver division of labor, couples who violate this type of gender norm may face a social stigma that can undermine relationship satisfaction and lead to a greater risk of separating. And so if this gender and we might imagine that this type of gender stress might be more intense or more severe in contexts where these more conservative gender norms are held more strongly. The second mechanism that we test is the anticipation of separation. So it's possible that this association between women's economic superiority and separation is actually a spurious association and instead reflects changes in the economic behavior of household members who expect to separate. So it's possible that, for example, women may increase their labor supply when they expect to separate deliberately to try to smooth the financial shock associated with separating. And then the final mechanism that we consider in this study is a work-family conflict mechanism. So we know that work-family conflict is associated with lower marital satisfaction and worse marital outcomes. And so it's possible that the association between women's relative earnings and separation may reflect heightened stressors that dual career couples face, and particularly dual career couples with children face in balancing work and family. And so in this case, separation may really be a consequence of the time pressure and work-family conflict that couples face, rather than necessarily a reflection of the balance of economic power within relationships itself. And so to test these three possible mechanisms. We draw on data from 5 major panel surveys from 2004 to 2019 that spans 29 countries in Europe and the US. So our main source of data is the European Union Statistics on Income and Living Conditions, or EU-SILC. EU-SILC is a cross-national longitudinal survey that includes all EU member states plus Norway, Iceland, and Switzerland. And the majority of countries in EU-SILC follow households for an average of 4 years. So it follows a majority of countries in EU-SILC follow a sort of 4-year rotating panel structure. So households are interviewed every year for 4 years, and 4 overlapping rotation groups are interviewed in each wave of the data. We harmonize the data from EU-SILC with several other data sources, including the Survey of Income and Program Participation from the US, or SIP. And for Germany and the UK, we actually don't use data from the EU-SILC for these countries for a couple of reasons. For Germany, it's a data access issue. For a majority of years in our period of analysis, the German EU-SILC data is just not publicly available, so we're not able to use that data. For the UK, there's a discrepancy with the income reference period in the EU-SILC UK data. For all other countries in the EU-SILC, income is collected with reference to the previous calendar year prior to interview. For the UK, it's collected with reference to the year of interview, which causes some issues in our analytic strategy that I'll talk about in a moment. That's a little bit difficult to overcome with only 4 years of data. So for that reason, for the UK, we use data from the British Household Panel Survey and the Understanding Society Survey. And for Germany, we use data from the German Socioeconomic Panel. And I'm happy to talk more about the sort of data issues in the Q&A for anybody who's interested in that. So we harmonize all data sources to follow the EU-SILC structure as closely as possible. So this means that we modify all other data sources to try to reflect the 4-year rotating panel structure and annual interview schedule of the EU-SILC. And I'm happy to go into more detail on the harmonization process in the Q&A. Our analytic sample consists of over 500,000 different sex married and cohabiting couples, aged 16 to 60. About 80% of our sample is married and 20% are cohabiting. Our outcome measure in this study is an annual measure of separation. So this is a binary indicator that indicates whether a couple is still together or whether they've separated. And so this is measured at the time of interview, and couples are coded as having separated if either partner changes their relationship status to indicate that they've separated or divorced, and the couple is no longer living together. Our independent variable, our key independent variable, is a measure of relative earnings. So this is measured with reference to the previous calendar year. And it's a measure of women's share of couple earnings in the previous calendar year. This is a categorical variable that distinguishes between male breadwinner couples where the woman earned less than 40% of couple earnings, equal earner couples where both partners earned between 40 and 60% of couple earnings, and female breadwinner couples where the woman earned more than 60% of couple earnings. We've also tested some models with a continuous and quadratic specification for relative earnings that show broadly similar results to what I'll talk through today. All of our models control for a variety of factors at the individual or couple level. So this includes whether both partners have 0 earnings, total family income, whether a couple is married or cohabiting, whether they have dependent children in the household, homeownership status, and then educational attainment and age. And at the country level, we control for GDP per capita, the unemployment rate, the gender wage gap, the proportion of dual earner couples in the country, and the crude divorce rate as well. We use hierarchical probability models in the study to examine the association between relative earnings and the annual risk of separation. So these are 3-level, multi-level models that reflect the nested structure of our data, where couples are nested within country years and then nested within countries. We include random intercepts and slopes for time, and reflecting recent developments in the multi-level modeling literature. We also include random slopes for relative earnings and any other lower level covariates that are implicated in cross-level interactions. We also include random slopes for 2 key lower level control variables. This is whether a couple is married or cohabiting, and women's educational attainment. And this is really to try to improve the precision of our estimates. Our basic analytic approach consists of 2 main parts. So we first estimate the association between relative earnings and the annual risk of separation, controlling for the individual and more macro level factors that I mentioned on the previous slide. And then we expand this baseline model in a variety of different ways to try to test these hypothesized mechanisms. So to test our gender culture mechanism, we test this using 2 different models that each include a cross-level interaction between women's relative earnings and a country-level measure of gender values or gender norms. So we draw on data from the European Social Survey, the International Social Survey Program, and the European Values Survey to try to capture the strength of male breadwinner values within a country and the strength of female caregiver values within a country. So the strength of male breadwinner values is measured as the proportion of individuals in a country who agree with the statement that men should have more right to jobs than women when jobs are scarce. And female caregiver values are measured by the proportion of individuals in that country who agree with the statement that children suffer when a mother works. And so if the gender mechanism is supported, we would expect to see variation in the association between relative earnings and separation according to the strength of these gender norms. For the anticipation of separation mechanism, first we test this mechanism by lagging our measure of relative earnings by an additional year and all other income measures in our model. In our baseline model, separation is measured at the time of interview, and income is measured or earnings is measured in the previous calendar year. So there's already some temporal distance in when these two variables are measured, but it's possible that individuals may anticipate separating for multiple months before they actually separate. And so it's possible that our baseline model may still sort of pick up on these behavioral responses in the expectation of separating. We reason that it's probably less likely that couples expect to separate for multiple years before they actually separate. And so our hope is that by lagging this relative earnings measure by an additional year, we can try to account for some of these behavioral changes in the expectation of separating. We also run another model where we include a measure of women's relative wages rather than relative earnings as our measure of sort of women's economic power within the couple. And this is really reflecting the fact that earnings tend to be more sensitive to changes in labor supply, and so may be particularly sensitive to these sorts of behavioral changes in the expectation of separating. Our wages tend to be less sensitive to these sorts of behavioral responses. And so by comparing our model with relative wages to our model with relative earnings, we can get a sense of how much is really can be attributed to behavioral changes in the expectation of separating. And then finally, for our work-family conflict mechanism, we first test this mechanism by running our baseline model with an additional control for the sum of his and her working hours. If the association between relative earnings and separation is really about time pressure and work-family conflict, we should see, once we control for the total volume of paid work within a couple, that this association attenuates. And then in the second test of this work-family conflict mechanism, we include an interaction term between relative earnings and parenthood status. We reason that dual career couples with children may be particularly likely to experience the kind of role conflict and work-family conflict that can undermine relationship satisfaction and lead to a greater risk of separating. And so if the work-family conflict mechanism is supported, we would expect to see a stronger link between relative earnings and separation for parents compared to couples without dependent children in the household. All right. So on to some results. So this figure shows purely descriptively patterns of separation by relative earnings in each of the 29 countries in our analysis. So on the y-axis, we have the proportion of couples in our sample who ultimately separate at some point during the roughly 4 years or so that couples are followed. And we present these rates of separation by women's average relative earnings within a couple during this 4-year period or so. And there are a few key patterns to note from these descriptive results. So first, it's quite clear that the overall rate of separation varies pretty substantially across countries. In some countries, separation is relatively more common, like in Sweden, Norway, and the UK. In other countries, separation is a relatively rare event. For example, Romania, Poland, and Bulgaria. It's also clear from these results that, at least descriptively, patterns of separation by relative earnings also appears to vary quite substantially across countries. In most countries, female breadwinner couples are more likely to separate than male breadwinner couples, but the degree of this difference varies quite a lot across countries. In some countries, this difference is pretty large, like in Norway and Austria. Female breadwinner couples are about twice as likely to separate than male breadwinner couples. But in other countries like Poland and Slovenia, the difference in the rate of separation between male breadwinner and female breadwinner couples is pretty small. And in other countries like Hungary, it actually doesn't look like there's a positive association between women's relative earnings and the risk of separation. It looks like there might be a negative association. And so these descriptive results lend some support to the idea that the association between women's relative earnings and separation is pretty context specific and pretty country specific. Once we account for the micro level and macro level characteristics in our baseline model, on average, we do see that women's relative earnings is positively associated with the annual probability of separation. So for all of our hierarchical probability models, we present our results in terms of average marginal effects on the annual probability of separation. And so in this graph, male breadwinner couples are the reference category, and the probability of separation for male breadwinner couples is represented by this red line at 0. And so the distance from this line at 0 indicates the average marginal effect of equal earnership and female breadwinnership on the annual rate of separation compared to male breadwinner couples. And so our baseline model results show that on average, female breadwinner couples are about 0.4 percentage points more likely to separate than male breadwinner couples are. And we also find that equal earner couples are about 1/10 of a percentage point more likely to separate than male breadwinner couples are. And the sizes of these associations might seem pretty small, but as we saw in the previous slide, separation is a relatively rare event. And the probability of separating in any given year is even rarer. So in our baseline model, for example, male breadwinner couples have about a 1.1 chance of separating in any given year. So the size of these associations, particularly for female breadwinner couples, are still substantively meaningful. Next, in testing our gender culture mechanism, we examine whether the association between relative earnings and the risk of separation varies by the strength of more conservative gender values within countries. And looking at the results for male breadwinner values first, we find that, contrary to our expectations, the association between relative earnings and separation really doesn't appear to vary very much by the degree of support for male breadwinner norms within countries. So in countries with weaker male breadwinner norms, where support for male breadwinner values is 1 standard deviation below the mean, the average marginal effect of female breadwinnership is nearly identical to the average marginal effect of female breadwinnership in countries with strong male breadwinner norms, where support for these male breadwinner values is 1 standard deviation above the mean. So really, from this model, we really don't see much in the way of evidence for a gender culture mechanism. For female caregiver norms, we do see maybe some evidence of variation in this association between relative earnings and separation by the strength of female caregiver values. The estimated marginal effect of female breadwinnership is larger in countries with stronger female caregiver values by about 1/10 of a percentage point compared to the average marginal effect of female breadwinnership in contexts with weak female caregiver values. But this difference is not statistically significant, and the interaction term in our model is not statistically significant either. So again, contrary to our expectations, we really don't find much in the way of convincing evidence of a gender culture mechanism, at least as we've measured gender culture here. Turning next to the anticipation of separation mechanism, our first test of this mechanism included a lagged measure of our relative earnings measure in the hopes of trying to account for any sort of behavioral changes in the expectation of separating. And after lagging our income measures, we do still see that female breadwinner couples are more likely to separate than male breadwinner couples. But the magnitude of this association is reduced by about 40% compared to our baseline model, which suggests to us that maybe some of this association estimated in our baseline model may be due to sort of these changes in the economic behavior of household members who expect to separate. And in our second test of this mechanism, we used a measure of relative wages rather than relative earnings, recognizing that wages tend to be less sensitive to changes in labor supply than earnings are. Again, we do still see a positive association between female breadwinnership and the risk of separating, but the magnitude of this association is reduced by about 25% compared to our baseline model. So again, we find some support again for the anticipation of separation mechanism, but clearly that's not all that's going on here. We do still find a pretty substantial and statistically significant positive association between female breadwinnership and separating. And then finally, to test our work-family conflict mechanism, we first controlled for the sum of men's and women's typical weekly working hours. And we find that controlling for the total volume of paid work within a couple does attenuate the association between women's relative earnings and female breadwinnership and separation by about 25%. So again, suggesting that maybe some of this association is due to the work-family conflict and sort of time pressure that dual earner couples face. But we do still, again, find a positive and statistically significant association between both female breadwinnership and equal earnership and separation. And then in our final test, we included an interaction term between parenthood status and relative earnings. And our results show a positive association between female breadwinnership and the risk of separating for both parents and for couples without dependent children in the household. But the magnitude of this association is about twice as large for parents compared to the association for couples without children. We also find that equal earnership is positively associated with the risk of separating for parents, where this is not the case for couples without dependent children in the household, where the annual probability of separating is for equal earners is roughly the same as it is for male breadwinner couples. And so we interpret these findings as providing some evidence of a work-family conflict mechanism, but we'd be eager to sort of hear your thoughts on these results as well. And so overall, our results show a strong positive association between women's economic superiority within different sex romantic partnerships and the risk of separating. And this is pretty consistent with previous research. But to our surprise, our results really emphasize individual and couple level mechanisms for this association rather than more context level mechanisms. So we find that this association may be partly driven by work-family conflict, as we find a stronger association for parents than for couples without children. And we find that the association attenuates once we control for the total volume of paid work within a couple. And we also find some evidence that the association between relative earnings and separation may be partly spurious and may reflect changes in couples' economic behavior once they already expect to separate. We really don't find much in the way of evidence for a gender culture mechanism, at least how we've approached trying to capture gender culture so far in this study. And this is a little bit surprising to us because this gender culture mechanism is often mentioned as a key potential driver of the decline in the association between relative earnings and separation over time. In our data, we also see a decline in this association over time. Just to present one more data point, we unfortunately don't have data in EU-SILC on when marriages start or when relationship starts. We're not able to look at how the relationship between relative earnings and separation varies across sort of marriage cohorts or relationship cohorts. But when we look at how this association varies across birth cohorts, and in particular women's birth cohorts in this case, we do see a substantially weaker association for younger birth cohorts than for older birth cohorts. And in particular, if we compare women born in the 1980s to women born in the 1960s, we see a much weaker association between female breadwinnership and the annual probability of separating. And so we're still trying to think through what might explain this type of variation over time. Our gender culture tests don't seem to support the idea that liberalizing gender norms and gender cultures explain this decline, although we're still trying to think of alternative ways of trying to measure gender culture that might try to get at this in a little bit better. But really the next big question that we're grappling with is what other, if any, contextual factors might explain this type of decline in the association between relative earnings and separation, and also the cross-national variation in this association that we see as well. If it's not gender culture, then what is it? We have some ideas of other context level mechanisms we'd like to explore in the future. So as I mentioned previously, some work by Kaplan and Steyer has really highlighted the importance of welfare state contexts in shaping the association between relative earnings and separation. And so we're hoping to try to get at some specific factors that might produce this type of variation systematically across welfare state regimes. So one idea might be to test the role of women's outside options outside of a marriage or marriage-like relationship by examining the economic well-being of divorced women or single women within countries to try to understand whether this moderates the association between relative earnings and separation. Another idea might be to examine specific policy supports for single mothers or childcare supports more broadly, which might make it more economically feasible to separate and therefore could reduce the association between women's relative earnings and separation. But that's really sort of where we're thinking of going next in this study. And some additional context level factors we're thinking of exploring. But we'd be really curious to hear your thoughts on, have we missed any big contextual mechanisms or other individual mechanisms? We're still sort of grappling with how to think about these null results for gender culture, if there are other ways that we should try to think about measuring gender culture. And really, we'd be very grateful for any thoughts or comments or questions that you have on our results so far more broadly.